Thank you so much for coming. We will get underway very shortly as people join. This is the latest edition of our teaching series, highlighting the amazing talent among our graduates. I'm going to begin with a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the HLS website. So the overall series is designed because most of us learn to teach by osmosis, a practice we now know inhibits learning compared to alternatives that give students more explicit instruction about how and why we're learning. And we can actually apply that to our skills as teachers as well. But today we're going to talk about first-generation law students and how we can make teaching more inclusive for them, and how we can all benefit as teachers of all our students from reflecting on our teaching practices. So today, Dean Manning, himself a first-generation law student, is going to say a few words, and then we're going to hear from our expert panelists, first Etienne Toussaint, then Rory Van Loo, then Angela Litwin, and we should have some time for discussion and questions. I am now going to get out of their way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Toussaint, and thanks to everybody for being here. So I want to start by thanking Professor Toussaint for organizing and building this excellent series on pedagogy and for pulling together a session on teaching first-gen students. It's such an important topic, and I'm really delighted to be here to introduce the session. You know, the need to focus on this is especially true in 1L. The first year of law school is a daunting learning experience, and everyone is on a steep learning curve. And I was a first-gen student. I felt throughout my first year that I just didn't know things that other people did. Someone would say something in class like, "That's a realist argument," and I would think that everyone around me knew what that meant. Everyone around me had knowledge that I didn't have. And that they all knew what was going on, and that I didn't. And so I have a couple of things to say about that. One is it's really important for us to make sure that we provide for all our students a baseline of the fundamentals of what it means to be a law student and to study law. And that's why we created HLS, and we're with other law schools, we are offering it to our students, and it's designed to help every student start with shared knowledge about the legal system, about law school, about what it means to be a law student, and about the vocabulary of the legal profession. And then the second thing is it's also so important for us to help our students understand that they shouldn't compare the way they're feeling on the inside with the way other people seem to be feeling on the outside, right? That it's natural to feel a little bit nervous and out of one's depth when you start a big new experience like law school. And I think it's important for all of us who have had that experience, whether we're first gen or not, to convey to our students that it's okay to feel uncertain as you learn something new. And that it's important to know that you're not alone, and that you're in law school not because of the things you know already, but because of the things you don't know, and you're there to learn. So anyway, thank you again for being here, all of you. And my thanks to Professor Toussaint and Professors Litwin, Toussaint, and Van Loo for being here for this important session today. Thank you, and I really again appreciate this wonderful series. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Etienne, do you want to get us started talking about some specific lessons that you would like other people to take away so we can serve our students better?
Sure. And so I guess the goal of today is to have a conversation about how we as faculty can think about crafting an educational space such that first generation law students can feel more included, more aware, more knowledgeable about aspects of the legal education experience that they may not know otherwise. And there are a number of reasons why they may not be aware, as you all can imagine. Most first generation students grow up in communities where they have limited exposure to lawyers in general. And so the language of law, the assumptions about how the legal system works, they don't walk into the door with those experiences. In addition, first-generation students often come from low-income communities, though not always, but oftentimes that is the case. And so additionally, because of the various challenges that face our society, there may be a number of other experiences that those students have had with the law that shape their educational experience. For example, a student growing up in a low-income community may have a very particular experience with the criminal system, with policing, for example, that might shape how they enter the classroom. And I think it's incredibly important for faculty and for the people who are running law schools more generally, which includes the staff and other individuals who are working to create the best educational experience for students, to really think about how people bring those different lived experiences into the building. And I can perhaps just share one story to get us started, and I'm happy to have a conversation later on, think through a couple more questions. But one story that I will share is in regard to my 1L year at Harvard in my criminal law class. I grew up in the South Bronx in New York City, and both of my parents are immigrants. My mother actually attended college, and so I guess I'm perhaps not technically first generation. My father did not attend college, was a high school graduate and became a bus transit operator. But my mother attended a local school, Pace University, went there for 2 years, and then spent 2 years, the following 2 years living at home. Both of her parents were immigrants from the Caribbean. And as a result, her being a single child really lived in an insulated community of her parents' friends and fellow immigrants that were trying to get acclimated to life in the United States, especially in the middle of the 20th century, where we're still wrestling with challenges related to civil rights and racial justice more generally today, but back then it was even more at a height. Although my mother had a limited exposure to college, I would say that she didn't really learn the language and have a clear sense of how to navigate that space going into it. And of course, spent half of that time living back at home and really was taking her coursework to then pursue a career in nursing. So for me, growing up in the Bronx, my exposure to law, my understanding of law really had to do with what I observed around me, and living in a predominantly Black and Hispanic community that was also predominantly low and middle income. My understanding of the law was the criminal justice system, which is to say the abundance of police officers that I saw around and interactions that the people in my community had with law enforcement. For example, I can very vividly recall 7th grade, coming home from school and seeing a mass of protesters about 3 blocks from my home on a street called Wheeler Avenue. And it was in fact the place where Amadou Diallo had been killed. And the following day, there was protesters, Al Sharpton was there. And so, that was sort of the world that I came from in terms of understanding the law as being represented by law enforcement, and understanding the law as a mechanism to control and coordinate the lives of people living in different communities. And to be sure, a very naive and sort of sophomoric understanding, but that was my exposure walking into law school. I studied engineering in college, so I didn't really have much exposure to legal concepts and legal principles. Walking into criminal law, then, that sort of shaped my worldview. And the most vivid memory I have of my criminal law class, and I don't practice criminal law, so much of it has escaped me. I don't teach criminal law either, but the most vivid memory that I have was learning about the case People v. Goats. And the reason why that case stuck out to me is because the case is actually about young teenage boys from the Bronx who took the train into Manhattan and had an encounter with a white man who ended up shooting them because he feared, as he professed, he feared for his life. He thought that they were going to harm or maim him. because they had approached him and asked him for money. Specifically, they had asked him for $5. And what was interesting to me in the classroom, as I read the case the previous night and prepared to enter the classroom, what was interesting to me was how the professor would coordinate a conversation about what the opinion had described as an issue of self-defense, but what I had lived as an issue of, low-income people of color interacting with a legal system that routinely positions them as a threat and then erects legal frameworks like self-defense that sometimes fails to interrogate the many different issues that are taking place. And to me, the classroom, in that specific class discussing that case, became a lost opportunity, I think, in terms of trying to unpack some of the nuances of that case, trying to think through issues of race and class, but also trying to think about the role of lawyering and the role of law in trying to resolve some of these unresolved issues that we have in our society, such as policing, such as crime, such as poverty, and the way that people engage in that environment and wrestle with those different issues. We really focused in that class on the opinion, the holding, the facts of the case, the traditional things that you do in the Socratic approach when you're trying to break down why the justices rendered the ruling that they did. But there was a lost opportunity in terms of bringing in a more broader and richer discussion about the sociology of New York City, the abundance of organizations outside of law enforcement that were trying to deal with issues of crime and law enforcement, and more specifically, the way that race has and continues to play a role in how people engage with the criminal justice system. So to me, that's just one example of how someone who has limited exposure to law can walk into the classroom with a unique lived experience that shapes their assumptions and biases about the law. And in fact, all students walk into the classroom with their lived experiences and assumptions about what the law means or can mean. And I think it's incumbent upon faculty, incumbent upon law school administrators to think about creating spaces where students feel comfortable sharing those unique experiences, being vulnerable, and talking about how they view the law and what the law means to them. And then really unpacking cases in ways that exposes shortcomings in the law, exposes the way the law may not attend to different experiences and different viewpoints. I could say much more, but I think that's one example of how people bring different experiences into the classroom. And it's important for faculty to create space for that, to talk about the assumptions that people have, to talk about the assumptions that are in the cases themselves and the experiences that are not being voiced in the opinions that we read with our students. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to continue the conversation and talk more about the nuts and bolts as we continue the conversation.
Great. So I'm going to hand it over to Rory, and I definitely have questions for you, but I'll save them for the discussion portion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree with everything Etienne said, and maybe at a top level at the outset, I just wanted to say that the first generation or low income family upbringing experience can come in so many different forms. And some are single working parent households, others are two-parent households. Some went to private schools, some went to public schools, and this kind of, Etienne already alluded to this kind of the great heterogeneity of student experiences. And to go even further on this theme, many students from even say professional backgrounds, lawyer families, high income families face some similar challenges as those from low income or first generation households. lawyer parents divorce as well, right? And a child from one of those single parent lawyer families with, say, a hardworking, super busy parent may not face the same challenges of information access about what it's like to be a lawyer, but they may encounter similar difficulties of not having grown up in a family where they're used to being in intellectual conversations around the dinner table every night, for example. And so I wanted to just highlight that great kind of diversity of backgrounds, both within first gen student populations and across the broader student populations, because a lot of what I'm going to be saying is not meant to be necessarily representative of all those backgrounds. In a lot of what might make sense to do in light of first gen or low income students' backgrounds may indeed be good for a wide variety of students, even who aren't from those backgrounds. And I think there's something really nice about that, because one of the upshots of thinking hard about first generation and low income students and their particular needs may highlight a set of pedagogical practices that are beneficial to the learning environment more broadly. Things like the 1L or 0L curriculum at Harvard Law School that kind of seeks to start everybody off with some basics and background that not everybody has. There's a whole variety of students that benefit from that, even if first gens disproportionately benefit. So with those kind of big picture thoughts in mind, I just want to get into a few more specifics. I'm going to focus on two main goals. One is, I guess, psychological, and the other is informational. And on the psychological side, I see the goal as helping first generation students to have a place to be in a psychological space that is most conducive to learning, right? Because the challenge is that many have higher levels of self-doubt or imposter syndrome because they assume that the other students learned skills growing up or have help from family or already know all of this. Dean Manning alluded to this challenge in his opening remarks. And while some nervousness is actually helpful for learning, right? Because it provides some motivation, energy, focus, too much of it can be detrimental to absorbing and analyzing and focusing on the classroom materials or reading materials. And so to the extent that professors can help students to feel like they belong, to lower their anxiety, maybe even to give them greater confidence, those are all good things, of course, that could advance these students' learning and kind of educational outcomes. And among the many challenges that first gen and low income students face is the extreme self-doubt, right? And one challenge is that many even professors who are first gen, I know because I've had some of these conversations with people, they often don't even share that openly. They still feel, even as adults who have made it, sometimes reluctant to mention their backgrounds because they worry that they're going to be judged, or growing up it was such a source of shame or something they were self-conscious about that it's not natural to share it, and also it's not clear that the classroom is the place to do so, right? And so that creates a problem of how do you encourage students to believe in themselves and to not feel like they're alone in what they're experiencing as professors. And I think both professors who are first generation or from low income backgrounds and all other professors have opportunities to do this if we dig deep. And what I mean by this is that there are ways, of course, there's a variety of ways in which any individual professor may have themselves struggled, right? They may have experienced anxiety or failure or self-doubt. I mean, these are common human experiences, right? And so I think it's okay and indeed desirable. I would encourage professors to not hesitate to share those experiences at times with their students, especially 1Ls. So that they know that as they're sitting there as one of 50 or 80 or whatever it is in that classroom, that those feelings are very much shared. And hearing that your professor also as a law student experienced those, or also in their life has experienced related, even if different, for different reasons, kind of feelings can go a long way to that student feeling less isolated. And so that's one thing that I think professors can do on the psychological side. There's a broader point here, which is that my understanding of the research is that, and my own personal experiences, is that some, if not many, first generation and kind of students feel more uncomfortable in a formal classroom setting and do better, in contrast, when professors can introduce elements of informality. What do I mean by that? So, and this can come in all kinds of different ways. There's no one way. I know Professor Jack Balkin, for example, sometimes starts off group settings with a silly question, like what was Elon Musk, what did Elon Musk find on Mars in his latest visit there? Or I put cute animals pictures on my PowerPoints, sometimes play music, contract law themed music. I bet you didn't know that was a genre. And the feedback I've gotten, especially from first gen students and other students from other backgrounds that cause them to feel like they might be out of place, is that those things that I do it helps them to relax, and that opens up the space for learning a little bit more. And by the way, there's a couple of for professors, because that's, I think, the main audience here in a lot of respects is for this webinar, is I think for professors, there's a lot of research that these kinds of things, using videos and jokes and personal anecdotes and all these things, just help students more broadly to learn. And I think it's more fun to teach in this way, to not constrain, for the professor to not feel so constrained, like they can't go in these directions because of some preconceptions about what the law school classroom needs to look like. So these are kind of some examples of things that can do. Another thing I do is to start off just by calling my very first class. I highlight how students are not yet capable of knowing what a good answer is and what a bad answer is. And so they should not mistake confidence for a substantive ability or content. And indeed, more broadly, that there's often situational factors that may influence one student's knowledge on a particular area that will even out over time in their law school experiences, that they shouldn't, wherever they are right now, they've got 3 years to develop their own area of expertise and interest, and so to not sell themselves short. So now, just quickly, so that's the psychological side. I just want to touch on the informational side. There's no one answer here, but this is the invisible curriculum, right? Many first gen and low income law students don't necessarily have the same knowledge about law review or clerkships or exam prep or the value of office hours, right? And so the more things that a professor can spell out that may seem obvious to them, and even if half or 2/3 of the students even know those things, just mentioning, I always make sure to mention clerkships in passing or other things. Not that everybody needs to do that or by any stretch or that it's for everybody, but just that what this thing is. And I try to sprinkle those throughout the semester, these kind of common knowledge tidbits. And so, but then the informational side is hard. And I just wanted to, on this, I just yesterday learned about a practice that I really like that I don't do, but I'm thinking about implementing. And this is from Professor Jennifer Chacon and at Stanford Law School. What she does is she announces one-on-one kind of informal coffee meetings and explicitly describes it as an opportunity to talk about issues outside of the classroom. To ask about summer jobs or clerkships or how the professor got it to where they did in life, and not necessarily for classroom materials, because a lot of first-generation students don't go at office hours. They miss out on the opportunities as a result to build connections with their professors and to get information that's valuable. So I think that's something that for all students is beneficial, but maybe particularly for first generation and low-income students. So I'll just close my opening remarks by returning to where I started, which is just this commonality that a lot of students have is worth keeping sight of, because in some ways, one of the main goals is a sense of inclusion and connectedness. And I think recognizing that there are shared experiences across professors and all students that can be drawn on to feel like we're in this together, and have some ways of bridging those gaps and empathizing. It should be part of the goal in creating a kind of inclusive learning environment. So thanks, and I look forward to hearing the rest of your comments and to the discussion.
Yeah, so thank you so much. It looks like Professor Litwin is still having some trouble, so let me give you both of you a couple of the questions that have come up for me. And one is, a lot of these pedagogical changes, represent different ways than we were taught, and therefore it seems like there aren't very many roadmaps. So if you had a colleague who says, I can't commit to changing, my entire teaching style, give me one thing I can do, right? And I'll do it. But tell me what I should prioritize, because everybody has the time that they devote to teaching versus other things. So that's my first question. One small change, what would you recommend?
Well, I'll start. First I would push back on the notion that a professor should only feel compelled to make a small change. I think it's our duty and job to try to provide the best experience possible for our students. And we all know that incrementalism is never the way to address bigger societal challenges. We're still dealing with issues that we were dealing with, 100 years ago. But I certainly understand the practical side of things. I think there are a lot of strategies that aren't new. And some of the things that I do are I stole, so to speak, from my law school professors. For example, Professor Singer, he offered sort of lunch group meetings in small groups with students during the first semester. And so that's something that I do in my contracts class, very similar to what Rory was mentioning. I meet with, I allow students to sign up for small groups, like 5 or so. And I set up some times across the semester. And it's an opportunity to sit down for lunch, talk. And oftentimes it's during those sessions where they ask me those questions they're afraid to ask in class, or about career or about clerkships or other things. And so that's a great space to just kind of eliminate the anxiety and tension of the classroom. Another strategy I adopt that I stole from Professor Toussaint is to put students in panels. And so I place students into panels, and they know what day they're on call, which means I will co-call them on those specific days. Of course, I encourage them to volunteer on other days. And, this past year I had a very engaged class, so it felt like the panel didn't matter because everyone was engaged, which was great. But I think for the students, it gives them a level of relief that there is a time that they can prepare and not feel that they're going to be caught off guard and embarrassed. So that's another strategy I take. Some of the things that I do that are different in my first year class, I try to weave in a little more about history, about legal education, really to help students understand some of these broader concepts like realism or critical legal studies and how that fits in. I try to help them understand some of the historical context of the cases, and that might mean pulling in like a newspaper clipping. And it's difficult to do that for every single case. So you might pick 2 or 3 cases where you can pull in a historical element, or you can talk about how that case was occurring during a broader debate among scholars about an issue like realism and formalism, just to kind of help them understand some of the broader dynamics of what's going on, or connect the case to, hey, this was during the time when we were in a war, right? And how does that impact what's going on and how people are thinking about these issues? So I try to bring in real world events to help students understand that the law is very much enmeshed in politics, and then invite students to share their worldview, their experience. What are some things that they've seen, where they come from, that support the case or contradict what the case is saying. If this case happened today, do you think it'd come out differently? Would you agree with it? And so really taking specific moments to invite students to talk about their experiences, where they're from, and how it might relate to the cases. And finally, I'll note that I do share in the very first class a little bit about myself, and I do it to alleviate some of the anxiety. And I know it's difficult for people to do that, and there's some privilege in terms of who can do it and when. I think as a male, I have some level of privilege in that regard. Although as a Black man, I certainly have some biases that may come along with other aspects of my identity. But I talk about where I'm from, talk a little bit about my family, and very briefly, like a 30-second elevator pitch, not more than what I did here. But I think it helps students to see like, oh, I can connect with this person, and if they could do it, I could do it too. So I would say that faculty should not feel afraid, even in that first class, to share a little bit about themselves, to try to connect with students and use it as a way for students to feel included in the classroom experience.
If of course, if it was one thing, I would go for the one-on-one meetings that I mentioned earlier, that opening up the space to have those one-on-one meetings with students. But granted, that's a one big thing, right? Because that's a lot of time if you have 80 students or so. And so I'll give a second one thing if professors don't feel like they have that much time. I would say do something, anything to normalize that anxiety and self-doubt that most of your students are experiencing. It can be your own an anecdote from your own time. It can be just sharing that if you're a professor that doesn't feel comfortable sharing an anecdote, just talk about the research. There's plenty of just data about this that you can share, that most students feel incredibly uncertain about their abilities. Most feel like imposters, and so you do it in some ways, and ideally early in their law school careers or in the classroom, just to know that you recognize that and that they are not alone in those feelings.
So that's really helpful. So one of the things that I think in these conversations, you sometimes encounter people who say, well, we can't coddle students. And I'm just interested in, what's the successful way to push back against that? Because I completely understand that there are a lot of big things we should be doing, but I think also it can sometimes become easier to do the big things once you've accepted that this is part of your mission, right? And so I'm sort of interested in the people who sort of think, well, it was good enough for me, right? And also, it was good enough for you. You guys made it through. So, what would you say to people who say, clearly whatever we're doing, it's already working?
Yeah, the way I would respond is I think it's a myth. I think it's a myth to believe that everyone makes it through law school purely on merit. I think it's this broader meritocracy ideal that drives how we govern ourselves in society. I think, we started this conversation just admitting that people have different lived experiences and they bring that into the classroom and they benefit from knowledge that they may or may not have had, experiences and exposures that they may or may not have had. And we as faculty can't see that. So people may be coddled in different ways, right? I had a law school classmate. I was in my first year working on a legal research and writing project, and I asked him, how are you doing this? Trying to figure out how to write this memo. He was like, oh, well, I showed it to my mom. His mom's a judge. So, and that's a kind of coddling that's like invisible, right? And the things that we don't see, the conversations that are happening behind the scenes that we aren't aware of. And so for me, one of the things that I try to do is for all my students is and not in all of my classes, I'm talking more specifically about my first semester class contracts, is I try to narrate a little bit the law school experience in general terms. And what I mean by that is I'll weave in brief conversations where I talk about the mechanics of what they're doing. Something as simple as, we're now at the middle of the semester, and this is the time when law students often begin to think about finals and begin to think about taking advantage of office hours and really thinking about approaching the final exam. And just sort of mention that in the beginning of the class, and I'll move on, but it's sort of something that just a nugget to drop. Or, a couple weeks in, I might just mention, we're 3 weeks in, this is probably the time when you start thinking about how are you approaching class and how do you spend your time outside of class, is outlining the same thing as briefing. And I'm happy to talk about those things in office hours. So I try to just narrate throughout the first semester, the mechanics without making it very blatant. And sometimes I will take a moment to model something. For example, I provide like a practice issue spotting essay exercise in my first semester class. And I'll actually just, briefly walk through a model answer and just say, what are the different parts of this answer? What are they doing? And that certainly takes time and it's hard. And that might be the one thing that you could do that's really, really helpful to students because it gives them a really great understanding of what your expectations are in terms of how you go through an analysis. But I think it's also helpful for students who are seeing this for the first time to see what is expected of me and how am I supposed to be doing this? So I think finding times to weave in, the mechanics of law school into the classroom can be very helpful for students who may assume I'll just study for finals when I get to the reading period, or my outline is all I need to prepare for exams, right? And they may not be internalizing everything. And unfortunately for some students who are going through the fire, they do learn the hard way. They get to the end of the semester, they take their exams and they realize, like, oh man, I should have been doing this. And the second semester is a little smoother. And I don't think we need to put all the students through the fire, so to speak. I think we can create an environment that is, more enriching. We don't need to haze everyone, even if we were hazed ourselves.
I might start just by acknowledging that this impulse to not want to coddle comes from usually or often a noble place or a well-intentioned place of wanting to prepare that student for the work world, right? And to set them up for success. And once you acknowledge that, then it's a question of, okay, so let's talk about what we know about how to best do that in the world we live in today. And to some extent, this is an empirical question. And there are multiple goals of any classroom, right? You want to impart knowledge on your students. You want to build skills. And this part about not coddling or the way you treat students is more of a psychological goal almost, right? A socialization. And so it's worth thinking about and asking yourself, you professor who's saying let's not coddle, how much of an expert you feel you are in psychology and socialization, and how much you might benefit from some of the empirical literature on this question, because once you think about those multiple goals of the classroom and the research suggesting that too much anxiety can get in the way of those other goals of knowledge and skill building, learning, it may be worth kind of at least adjusting a little bit towards where the evidence points. And also, I might point out that if your goal, even if we acknowledge your goal is valuable of exposing students to this harsh or tough treatment at some point, there's a question of where that fits into the law school experience and whether you need to have that in every classroom environment as opposed to somewhere else. And for many professors, when they were in law school, they didn't have clinics there with it, whereas the clinic is now the place where that seems the more natural home for creating, for coaching and exposing to those kinds of dynamics, and not to mention the fact that you may even just be able to do as good of a job by describing this thing rather than actually implementing that behavior in the classroom. And then I'll just say a final note on this, and that is that for some professors, at least, I think we have a sense that although preparing the individual student for life as a lawyer is probably the most important part, there's also a broader societal role we're playing as academic institutions, and we are influencing the future of the legal community. And so if we are saying that, if we are taking some of the flaws that we identify in the legal world and saying we're going to then integrate those into the classroom, and then that's a form of modeling that teaches students and maybe perpetuating or encouraging behavior that's not desirable from a societal and cultural and community perspective. And so there might be an element of just encouraging them to model the behavior that they would want to have in a kind of work environment, and to bring that into the classroom.
Thank you. I want to pick up on a couple of things that both of you said. So I guess in reverse order, I really like, Rory, your emphasis on pointing out that we actually share the same goals, right? That a lot of this is actually coming from a place of deeply wanting the students to succeed. We just may have outdated expectations about what that will take, or sort of folk knowledge that isn't actually real knowledge. And so pointing out that that's everyone here really wants our students to, every student who can succeed to succeed, can be very helpful. Etienne, I was really interested in the idea of sort of walking through stuff. And we are increasingly encouraged and sometimes required to do formative assessments. And so one thing that I've experimented with and feel very good about is actually assignments that sort of ask students to find something in their lives that it relates and bring it back. Or so, you know, because I teach advertising, you know, find an ad that you've been shown and sort of something about whatever we're working on that day. I guess if you have thoughts about other ways to do that. So, you know, the benefit of sort of giving them free choices, they can kind of disclose as much as they want, right? And not and sort of keep silent about stuff that they don't care about. And I've had students, you know, go both ways in terms of, you know, picking something very generic or picking something that's very clearly a specific interest or you know, or thing that they're connected to. So I know we have, you know, we have limited time, but you know, is there a way to do more of that without kind of increasing the grading burden, which, you know, not everybody can do. So I don't know if you have other thoughts, but, you know, in contracts, like, you know, find a contract that you've signed. Sometimes I ask them to actually take a look at the contract they've signed with the law school, or I ask just like, do you know what it says? And of course they say no.
Yeah, I don't have a specific example to add to what you've given. I think you provided a really great suggestion and example there in terms of how to ask students to bring in something from their lived experience into the classroom that's relevant to the topic at hand. And I absolutely am sensitive to the worry that many faculty have in terms of having to grade multiple assignments when you have 80 students, sometimes even more, over the course of a 14-week semester. One of the things that I've done that I also stole from Professor Singer is I coordinate in my first semester contracts class and in-class debate. I break the students into groups of policy debate when we reach the point of the semester where it's relevant, and break the students into groups. And the students understand that it will be part of their participation grade. But one, it's an opportunity for them to work in groups. I sort of use the panel system to just already establish groups. Two, it's a time for them to sort of prepare for participation and engagement. But three, because it's focused on policy, it sort of allows them to create these arguments that can draw from their experiences, what they've seen, or data that they've found that resonate with them. And they have I give them different sort of aspects of policy to think about and focus on. So part of the exercise is helping them to learn how to make good policy arguments. But I've experienced that as one good way for students to sort of bring unique experiences and ideas into the room. You know, oftentimes they'll assign a few people as spokespersons for their group, but you still get a nice, rich, diverse set of ideas. And they're explaining, you know, where these ideas come from. That's been an interesting way I've seen to get a unique conversation going about how we could think about the law in so many different ways if we take different perspectives.
So I want to make sure if our listeners have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. But I will. I can keep going. So I don't want you to you know, do anything that's uncomfortable. But if you would be willing to talk about things that really came across as inclusive or exclusive in your experience. So, you know, like I know as somebody with a background of privilege, I have made some dumb assumptions in my life. And I don't think I stopped when I became a professor. I do my best, but are there sort of things that you think could be easily fixed if we, in terms of like the assumptions about background that people make? Because you mentioned sort of, a realist argument, for example. I don't know if that's a clear enough question. But like, yeah, a moment that was really either welcomed you in or pushed you out. And I'm also thinking about, in the hidden curriculum, the idea that first generation students often don't even know that office hours are when you're supposed to come to the office, as opposed to when the professor is working on their own and should not be disturbed. Which, it never occurred to me that I should explain what office hours are for. And so now I know something.
I'll just share one anecdote. This is more from my student time than from my professorial experience. But when so one of the first times when I felt comfortable in a formal academic setting was when the professor started the class off with saying something just extremely silly, and everybody was laughing, and it just felt very, it just lowered the pressure in the room. And I just remember that whole class feeling a lot better. I will say that on the other side, I think there's a lot of ways that professors sometimes talk about different groups making assumptions, or maybe a better way to say this is a positive way to say this is that there are opportunities to paint the different groups' identities in positive lights by sharing anecdotes in your hypos or your PowerPoints, choosing individuals that are kind of inspiring from various groups, or that many would view in a positive light, as opposed to potentially choosing individuals from those groups who are kind of less attractive, if that makes sense. So sharing, there are a lot of presidents, for example, that were first generation college students or from low income backgrounds, and from Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton to some extent, and I think I try to think about this in my PowerPoints, and when professors are cognizant of the group that they may be inadvertently capturing with one anecdote, or one, even if it's a case too, maybe even be cognizant of the cases, and how if they, I struggle even with Williams v. Walker Thomas Furniture Company, and some of the, it's like it's a tough balancing act to use a case with a single mother on welfare with like 7 kids, and how to talk about that in the right way, but at least trying to be cognizant as a professor that you don't want to encourage stereotypes, but you might actually then counteract those kinds of, if you are using those kinds of examples, counteract them with also the things that would make students from those backgrounds feel good about, and be reminded that there are some really successful or positive versions of this identity as well.
Yeah, I don't strive to make students feel comfortable about the law. I try to normalize the truth that many people feel uncomfortable about law, based on their experiences or where they come from or what they've observed or their beliefs or views, right? They may just feel very uncomfortable about different aspects of law because of their beliefs or ideologies or views, politically, religious views, etc., or their race or ethnicity or experience or class. And I try to, allow space for that to be okay, for people to feel uncomfortable, and try to, as best as I can, convey to students that it's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's okay to not agree. It's okay to feel like what we're reading contradicts your experience, and we can talk about that. Right? That's the whole point, that we're trying to sort of unpack and interrogate and think about the way the law falls short, the way the law can be improved and reformed. That's sort of the project of the lawyer. They'll constantly be thinking about how to take the law one step further. And one very practical thing that I do, is how I write exams in my fact patterns. When I'm putting the names of people, I very intentionally pick for different questions, like very obvious names that are associated with different ethnicities. I know a lot of professors think, well, I should shy away and just say like Professor X or Mr. A or Miss B and try to neutralize it. I personally think that's the wrong way to go. I think being color conscious, so to speak, or being conscious of differences and conscious of what is normalized, most of the opinions that we read abstract away those differences, race, gender, class. And I try to put it back into fact patterns so students realize these are real people, right? And I can't assume that this person is from one class or one group, right? I might use a very obviously Asian name or a very obviously Hispanic name or an obviously African name and sprinkle it throughout in interesting ways. And it's a very subtle technique, but I think it reminds the students that these issues impact everyone in different ways. And we're not talking about something abstract, we're talking about something very real. So that's something that I've done.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it's a great note to end on, because right at the end of the day, we're real people with a lot of different backgrounds, and students. I think students benefit. I do this too, and I also have this instruction saying, like, basically check your pronoun use. Like if somebody is explicitly identified as female, make sure to call her she, because that's the direction it always goes. And students, what I say is like, nobody does this on purpose, but if you do it, there will be people who notice and who will judge you. And so, you should get practice in paying attention to how somebody wants to be referred to. So thank you so much. I'm really sorry that Professor Lippman wasn't able to join us, but hopefully I'll be able to snag her for something else. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and your suggestions. We really appreciate it. And we're gonna put it up on the website. Hopefully it'll continue to be available. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.